Snow doesn't just fall, it buries. When a freak atmospheric anomaly wiped Crestwood off the map, Henry Pendleton was the only man ready. They mocked him for gutting a 1998 Bluebird school bus. But when the grid snapped, his paranoid obsession became the town's only desperate hope for survival. Henry Pendleton was not a doomsday prepper in the traditional sense. He didn't wear camouflage, he didn't hoard military surplus weaponry, and he certainly didn't run a YouTube channel broadcasting his theories to the world. He was a retired heavy-duty diesel mechanic, a widower for 6 years, and a man who had simply lived long enough to harbor a deep, unshakable distrust of modern infrastructure. Living on the outskirts of Crestwood, a modest logging town nestled deep in the shadow of the Cascade Range, Henry had spent the last 2 years of his life pouring his pension into a project that made him the punchline of local jokes. It was a 1998 Bluebird All-American Transit-style school bus. He had purchased it at a county auction for exactly $3,400. When he first towed it onto his 2-acre property, its yellow paint was peeling, its tires were bald, and its interior smelled of decades of spilled juice boxes and floor wax. To the townspeople, it was an eyesore. To Henry, it was an armored life raft. Day after day, under the blistering July sun and the crisp October winds, Henry worked. He ripped out the vinyl seats, grinding down the bolts until the floor was a flat, empty cavern of corrugated steel. He treated the rust, sealed every seam with industrial-grade caulk, and then began the real work. He framed the interior with 2x4s, packing every inch of the walls, ceiling, and floor with closed-cell spray polyurethane foam boasting an R value of 7 per inch. Going to the moon in that thing, Artie? Mayor Thomas Higgins had joked one afternoon, outside Miller's Hardware. Henry had just purchased heavy-gauge steel plating and heavy-duty snow chains. "Just making sure I stay warm, Tom," Henry had replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Grid's old, wires are brittle. Nature doesn't care about your tax bracket." Henry installed a Drolet cast-iron wood stove near the front, bolting it to a fireproof hearth pad. He routed a triple-wall stainless steel chimney pipe through the roof. He lined the interior with cedar planking, built reinforced storage bays beneath the chassis, and stocked them with dense, calorie-heavy provisions: Murray's, vacuum, sealed oats, dried beans, and cord after cord of seasoned oak. He overhauled the Cummins 8.3-liter diesel engine, installing heavy-duty block heaters and a dual alternator setup. His crowning achievement, however, was the custom V-plow he welded to the reinforced front bumper, operated by a hydraulic winch system. His closest neighbor, a 32-year-old single mother named Sarah Jenkins, watched this transformation from her kitchen window 50 yards away. She lived in a drafty, modular home with her 8-year-old son, Leo. Sarah was polite to Henry, occasionally bringing over a plate of cookies, but she too thought the grief of losing his wife had simply driven him a bit eccentric. Henry accepted the cookies, thanked her, and quietly advised her to buy a generator. She laughed it off. Money was tight, and besides, the town had never lost power for more than a few hours. Then came the second week of February. The National Weather Service had been tracking a low-pressure system moving down from the Gulf of Alaska, but the models were conflicting. Some predicted a heavy dusting, others suggested a standard winter storm. But when that Arctic air mass collided violently with an unseasonably warm, moisture-heavy Pineapple Express funneling up from the Pacific, the atmosphere didn't just storm, it detonated. Meteorologists later called it a bomb cyclone. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky over Crestwood turned the color of bruised iron. The temperature, which had been a mild 35 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted to single digits in a matter of hours. The wind didn't howl. It screamed a sustained, deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the houses. By 4:00 p.m., the snow was falling so thick and fast it created a complete whiteout. Visibility dropped to 0. By 6:15 p.m., the crisis struck. A massive, ancient Douglas fir, groaning under the weight of wet, rapid-freeze ice, snapped near the town's main substation. It took out the primary transmission lines. The explosion lit up the dark, swirling sky in a flash of blinding blue-green plasma, and then Crestwood went entirely black. Inside the Bluebird, Henry Pendleton was calmly reading a paperback western, By the light of an LED lantern, the drole stove was crackling, radiating a deep, bone-warming heat that kept the interior at a comfortable 72 degrees. When the lights in Sarah's house across the yard flickered and died, Henry slowly marked his page and closed the book. He walked to the heavily tinted, double-paned window and peered out into the churning abyss. He couldn't see Sarah's house. He couldn't see his own front gate. He could only see a terrifying, swirling wall of white. "Well," Henry muttered to himself, tossing another log into the stove. "Here we go." He checked his battery bank. Fully charged. He checked the draft on the stove. Perfect. He had food, water, and heat to last him 3 straight months. He was safe. He was entirely self-sufficient. But as the wind battered the steel sides of his fortress, Henry felt a gnawing unease in his gut. The temperature gauge outside the bus was plummeting. -10, -15, -22. And the storm was only just beginning. By midnight, the ambient temperature had dropped to -38 degrees Fahrenheit. With the wind chill factoring in gusts of up to 70 miles per hour, the effective temperature was flirting with -70. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes solid in less than 5 minutes. Engine blocks crack. Modern, poorly insulated homes transform into wooden freezers. Inside his mobile fortress, Henry was sipping black coffee, listening to the horrifying symphony of the storm. The wind sounded like a freight train, endlessly circling his property. Despite the heavy insulation, the steel skeleton of the bus groaned under the sheer concussive force of the gales. Henry's plan had always been simple: survive. He had built this shelter to protect himself, to ensure he wouldn't freeze in the dark, like the helpless masses he knew would eventually succumb to their own lack of preparation. He was a practical man, devoid of hero complexes. But then, over the roar of the wind, he heard it. It was faint at first, a dull, rhythmic thudding against the heavy steel of the bus's folding doors. Henry froze, his coffee mug hovering inches from his lips. Thud, thud, thud. He stood up, his joints popping, and grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight he kept by the door. He hesitated. Opening the door meant letting out precious heat, and in a whiteout like this, he couldn't see what or who was out there. Thud, thud. A muffled, agonizing wail bled through the layers of metal and foam. Henry threw the deadbolt and yanked the hydraulic door lever. The wind tore the door open, nearly ripping it off its hinges, and blasted Henry with a shockwave of cold so violent it felt like a physical punch to the chest. A cloud of crystalline ice exploded into the warm cabin. Falling over the threshold and collapsing onto the rubberized floor were 2 figures, completely encased in snow. Henry grabbed the door handle, fighting with every ounce of his strength against the wind, and managed to slam it shut, locking it down. The sudden silence inside the bus, save for the roaring stove, was jarring. He dropped to his knees. It was Sarah. She was clutching a bundle of moving blankets tightly to her chest. "Help," she whispered. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. Her eyelashes were frozen together, and her hands, devoid of gloves, were stark white and stiff as marble. Henry immediately went to work. "Don't move, Sarah. Let me get the blankets." He peeled the heavy moving blankets back. Beneath them was 8-year-old Leo, shivering so violently his teeth were audibly clicking. The boy was wearing his winter coat, a hat, and mittens, but it wasn't nearly enough. "House." "The roof," Sarah stammered, her words slurring dangerously, a late-stage sign of severe hypothermia. Truss snapped. Cold came in. Furnace died. Henry stripped off their wet, frozen outer layers. He grabbed thermal mylar blankets from his emergency kit and wrapped them tightly, moving them as close to the drole stove as safely possible. He poured hot water from the kettle resting on the stove into a thermos, adding sugar and instant cocoa, and forced Sarah to take tiny sips. "You walked 50 yards in this?" Henry asked, his voice tight. It was a miracle she hadn't become disoriented and wandered off into the woods to freeze. "Followed the fence line," she gasped, her body slowly absorbing the radiant heat. "Saw the smoke from your chimney. Henry, it's so cold in the house. We were going to die." "You're safe now," Henry said, though his heart was pounding. He looked at the frostbite forming on her fingertips. They would need slow warming in lukewarm water to save the tissue. But he had the medical supplies for it. As the boy, Leo, finally stopped shivering so violently and fell into an exhausted sleep on Henry's makeshift bed, Sarah sat in a camping chair by the fire, nursing the mug of cocoa. "Henry," she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength. Her eyes were wide with a terror that the heat of the bus couldn't melt away. "You don't understand." Henry looked up from bandaging her hands. "Understand what?" "My phone. It had a sliver of battery before we left," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "The town's emergency broadcast went out over text before the cell towers froze." "What did it say?" "The high school," she choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes and instantly drying in the heat of the stove. "The high school gymnasium. That's where Mayor Higgins told everyone to go if the power failed. They have that big industrial generator." "I know it," Henry said, a knot forming in his stomach. The gymnasium had a flat, wide-span roof, designed for rain and moderate snow, not for the weight of a bomb cyclone. "Henry, the roof collapsed," Sarah sobbed. "At 8 o'clock tonight, the text said there are over 100 people trapped in there. The generator was crushed, they have no heat, and Chief Deputy Harris, he sent a final message, saying the plows are frozen solid at the depot. No one can get to them." Henry stared at the crackling flames in the stove. The high school was 3 miles away. 3 miles of unplowed roads, buried under snowdrifts that were likely 5 feet high by now, in a whiteout blizzard with wind chills that could kill a man in minutes. He looked at his bus. He looked at the heavy steel V-plow bolted to the front frame. He looked at the chained, aggressive tread tires. He had built this machine to keep the world out. He had designed it to survive the apocalypse, alone. He was a retired mechanic. He was old, his back ached, and he owed these people nothing. They had laughed at him. "Henry?" Sarah whispered, seeing the conflict warring behind his eyes. Henry stood up, walking to the driver's seat. He wiped condensation off the windshield, looking out into the blinding, swirling void. He thought of his late wife, Martha, who had always chastised him for being too cynical, too detached from the community. "You can't take all your tools to the grave, Artie," she used to say. "Sometimes you have to use them to fix things for other people." Henry gripped the massive steering wheel. The Cummins diesel engine was already warm, thanks to the block heater hooked up to his internal battery bank. He turned back to Sarah. "Keep the stove stoked. Don't let the fire go out. Do not open that door for anyone but me." Sarah's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" Henry reached up and twisted the heavy key in the ignition. The massive 8.3-liter engine roared to life, a deep, guttural vibration that shook the floorboards and drowned out the sound of the wind. "I'm taking the bus for a drive," Henry said, engaging the hydraulics to lower the massive steel V-plow. "I'm going to school." Henry dropped the massive transmission into drive. The 1,998 Bluebird lurched forward, the heavy-duty snow chains biting aggressively into the packed ice of his driveway. As the custom-welded steel V-plow struck the first 5-foot snowdrift at the edge of his property, the entire bus shuddered. The snow exploded outward in a massive white wave, parting around the aerodynamic wedge of the plow. He was out on County Road 9. Under normal circumstances, the drive to Crestwood High School took exactly 6 minutes. Tonight, Henry knew it might take the rest of his life. Visibility was virtually non-existent. The high beams of the bus reflected blindingly off the swirling vortex of snow, rendering them useless. Henry switched on the low-mounted amber fog lights he had installed just weeks prior. They cut through the dense white curtain just enough to illuminate the faint, snow-buried outline of the tree line to his right. He was driving entirely by memory and the tactile feedback of the steering wheel. The Cummins 8.3-liter diesel engine roared, a mechanical beast battling the elements. The heater fans in the cab blasted, but the sheer, radiating cold from the windshield still leached the warmth from Henry's bones. He gripped the wheel with thick leather work gloves, his knuckles white. A mile in, the bus suddenly jolted violently. A horrific screech of metal on metal echoed through the cabin, loud enough to temporarily drown out the screaming wind. The steering wheel jerked hard to the left, nearly snapping Henry's wrists. He slammed on the air brakes. The bus skidded, fishtailing slightly before grinding to a halt. Henry grabbed his maglite, threw open the folding doors, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind instantly stole the breath from his lungs. The ambient temperature was so low it felt like inhaling broken glass. He fought his way to the front of the bus, shining the heavy beam of the flashlight over the plow. He hadn't hit a rock, he had hit a Ford Explorer. It was buried so completely, it looked like just another snowdrift. The steel V-plow had sliced into the SUV's rear quarter panel. Henry wiped the snow from the driver's side window of the Explorer. Empty. The occupants must have abandoned it and sought shelter. He prayed they had made it. Henry climbed back into the bus, shivering uncontrollably as the cabin heater struggled to compensate for the frigid air he had let in. He threw the transmission into reverse, backed up 20 yards, and then shifted into a low gear. He couldn't go around. The drainage ditches on either side of the road were invisible death traps. He had to go through. With a grimace, he gunned the engine. The bus surged forward. The V-plow slammed into the rear of the Explorer. The heavy steel frame of the Bluebird didn't falter. With a sickening crunch of fiberglass and shattering glass, the bus pushed the 2-ton vehicle off the pavement, bulldozing it into the ditch like a discarded toy. "Sorry, friend," Henry muttered, accelerating back up to a crawling 15 miles per hour. The closer he got to the center of town, the deeper the snow became. The wind was funneling down Main Street, creating drifts that reached the bottom of the bus's windshield. The engine temperature gauge, which should have been struggling to stay warm, began to slowly climb. The radiator was working overtime against the immense strain of pushing thousands of pounds of wet, heavy snow. Finally, the shadow of Crestwood High School loomed out of the whiteout. Henry's stomach dropped. The situation was far worse than Sarah had described. The main gymnasium, a sprawling structure added to the school in the late 80s, was completely pancaked. The massive steel trusses had sheared under the weight of the ice and snow, bringing the entire flat roof down into a V-shape. Henry navigated the bus into the parking lot, plowing a wide circular path to ensure he had a clear exit route. He parked 20 feet from the surviving main entrance, left the massive diesel engine idling, and stepped out. He waded through waist-deep snow to the double-glass doors of the school. They were chained shut from the inside. Henry banged on the glass with the heavy end of his flashlight. Nothing. He shone the light inside. The hallways were pitch black. Panic flared in his chest. Had they frozen? Had he risked everything for a tomb? Then, a faint, flickering light appeared at the far end of the corridor. A figure stumbled forward, holding a dying camping lantern. It was Greg Harrison, a town deputy Henry had known since Greg was a teenager, stealing apples from his orchard. Greg fumbled with the chain, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the padlock twice. When the doors finally yielded, Henry pushed inside. The air in the hallway was shockingly cold, easily below zero. But that wasn't what made Henry stop in his tracks. It was the smell. Beneath the scent of frozen dust and fear, there was the distinct, acrid stench of exhaust and melting wire insulation. "Greg," Henry barked, grabbing the young deputy by the shoulders. "Where is everyone?" "Cafeteria," Greg stammered, his lips cracked and bleeding. The gym roof went. Mayor Higgins moved everyone to the cafeteria. We lost 3 people in the collapse, Henry. It was so fast." "Listen to me," Henry said, shaking him slightly. "Do you smell that?" Greg blinked, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused from hypothermia. The generator. It was crushed by the HVAC unit when the roof went. Higgins tried to fire up the emergency backup in the boiler room, but the exhaust vents are buried in snow. Henry's blood ran cold. The backup is running? In an unventilated basement? It's barely keeping the cafeteria at 30 degrees. "It's pumping carbon monoxide into the ventilation shafts," Henry yelled, shoving past the deputy. He sprinted down the dark hallway, his heavy boots echoing on the linoleum. When he burst through the double doors of the cafeteria, the sight stopped his heart. Over 80 people were huddled on the floor, wrapped in whatever they could find, curtains torn from the auditorium, cheerleader banners, trash bags. But the silence was terrifying. People weren't shivering anymore. Many were slumped over, lethargic, their skin flushed, an unnatural cherry red, the hallmark sign of severe carbon monoxide poisoning. Mayor Thomas Higgins was sitting against a wall, his head in his hands, barely conscious. "Get up," Henry roared, his voice booming through the cavernous room. "Everyone who can walk, get up now. You are being poisoned." Chaos, muted by exhaustion and toxic air, erupted. Henry grabbed Principal David Caldwell, who was leaning heavily against a lunch table, and shoved him toward the door. "Dave, get them moving!" "Out the front doors. I have a bus outside." "A bus?" Caldwell coughed, his eyes glassy. "Artie, the roads are impassable." "My bus isn't," Henry growled. "But if you stay in here for another 20 minutes, you're all dead." "Move!" Henry waded into the crowd, physically lifting children and shoving them into the arms of dazed parents. He found Higgins, grabbed the lapels of his heavy winter coat, and hoisted the mayor to his feet. "Wake up, Tom." Henry slapped the man's cheek. "Walk." The evacuation was agonizingly slow. People were disoriented from the carbon monoxide, stumbling over each other in the dark. Henry and Deputy Harrison formed a human chain, physically dragging the most lethargic survivors down the freezing hallway and out into the howling blizzard. As the first survivors reached the open doors of the Bluebird, the blast of 72-degree heat from the wood stove hit them like a physical wall. "To the back! Move all the way to the back!" Henry shouted over the roaring wind, standing by the door and hauling people up the stairs. A standard school bus is designed to hold 72 children. Henry had stripped the seats, creating open floor space, but he was loading adults, wearing bulky winter gear. The interior quickly filled. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, sitting on the corrugated steel floor, leaning against the cedar-paneled walls, crammed into every available square inch. The heavy-duty leaf springs of the bus groaned under the immense weight. 70 people, 75, 80, that's everyone. Deputy Harrison yelled, practically throwing the last survivor, a teenage girl, up the stairs before climbing in himself. 82 alive. Henry climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the hydraulic lever. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in. The air inside the bus immediately grew dense, thick with the smell of wet wool, sweat, and desperate, gasping breaths. "Listen to me," Henry yelled over the murmuring crowd. The Drolet stove in the back was radiating heat, but the sheer volume of frozen bodies was rapidly dropping the cabin temperature. "Keep breathing. The oxygen will flush the carbon monoxide out of your blood. Do not fall asleep." He slammed the bus into gear. The suspension screamed in protest. He had nearly 10,000 pounds of human cargo in the back. Henry pressed the accelerator. The rear dual tires spun helplessly on the ice for 2 terrifying seconds before the heavy chains finally dug in. The bus lurched forward, breaking free of the fresh drifts that had formed around it. The drive back was a slow-motion nightmare. The weight of the passengers drastically altered the center of gravity. Every time Henry hit a submerged snowdrift with the V-plow, the rear of the bus fishtailed violently. He had to ride the steering wheel like a bucking bronco, constantly counter-steering to keep the massive vehicle out of the invisible ditches. "Henry," Harrison called out from the middle of the bus. "The engine, it smells like it's burning." Henry glanced at the dashboard. The temperature gauge was pinned in the red. Pushing the snow, pulling the immense weight, and running the dual alternators to keep the battery bank from dying was pushing the Cummins engine past its breaking point. "We're almost there," Henry lied. They were still a mile out. He rolled down his driver's side window 2 inches, letting the negative 40-degree air blast directly onto his face to keep himself awake and focused. His arms ached with a deep, lactic acid burn from wrestling the heavy steering wheel. Half a mile from his property, they hit a drift that was easily 6 feet high. The plow buried into it, and the bus groaned, the tires spinning uselessly. They were stuck. Panic rippled through the packed cabin. A woman began to sob. "Shut up," Henry roared. Though his own heart was hammering against his ribs, he couldn't fail now. Not when they were so close. He threw the transmission into reverse, backing up 10 feet. He took a deep breath, shifted back into drive, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The diesel engine screamed, black smoke billowing from the exhaust. The bus slammed into the drift with the force of a battering ram. The impact threw everyone forward. The steel V-plow buckled slightly, but the sheer momentum of the heavily loaded bus tore through the ice wall. They broke out the other side, the engine whining in agony. Minutes later, the faint, golden glow of the LED lantern shining through his property gate came into view. Henry piloted the groaning, overheating bus onto his land, parking it safely behind the windbreak of his heavy steel garage. He shut off the engine. The sudden silence, save for the crackling of the wood stove in the back and the collective breathing of 82 people, was deafening. He let his head fall forward onto the steering wheel, his entire body trembling from exhaustion. From the back of the bus, a small voice broke the silence. It was Leo, Sarah's young son. "Mr. Henry," the boy said, "are we at the moon yet?" A weak, exhausted chuckle rippled through the freezing packed crowd. Mayor Higgins, his face streaked with soot and tears, slowly made his way to the front of the bus. He looked at the heavy steel plating, the spray foam insulation, the roaring wood stove. He looked at the man he had mocked just months prior. "Henry," the mayor whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything, Tom." Henry replied gruffly, unbuckling his seatbelt and standing up to check the fire. "Just grab some more oak from the storage bay. We've got a long 3 days ahead of us." They stayed in the bus for 72 hours. The bomb cyclone raged outside, burying Crestwood under 6 feet of snow and snapping power lines across 3 counties. Inside the Bluebird, it was cramped, it smelled terrible, and meals consisted of rationed MREs and dried oats. But it was 70 degrees, and nobody died. When the National Guard finally broke through the roads with heavy rotary plows on Saturday morning, they found the town abandoned, save for a single yellow school bus parked on the outskirts, a plume of wood smoke rising defiantly into the clear, freezing sky. Henry Pendleton never received a medal. He didn't want one. But nobody in Crestwood ever made a joke about his paranoia again. And the next summer, when Henry went to Miller's Hardware to buy supplies to upgrade the bus's suspension, the owner absolutely refused to take his money. If Henry's incredible journey reminds us of anything, it's that the line between eccentric and visionary is often drawn by disaster. Survival isn't just about gear. It's about the grit to act when the world freezes over. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a true tale of resilience, and subscribe for more gripping survival stories. Henry pressed the accelerator. The rear dual tires spun helplessly on the ice for 2 terrifying seconds before the heavy chains finally dug in. The bus lurched forward, breaking free of the fresh drifts that had formed around it. The drive back was a slow-motion nightmare. The weight of the passengers drastically altered the center of gravity. Every time Henry hit a submerged snowdrift with the V-plow, the rear of the bus fish-tailed violently. He had to ride the steering wheel like a bucking bronco, constantly counter-steering to keep the massive vehicle out of the invisible ditches. "Henry," Harrison called out from the middle of the bus. "The engine. It smells like it's burning." Henry glanced at the dashboard. The temperature gauge was pinned in the red. Pushing the snow, pulling the immense weight, and running the dual alternators to keep the battery bank from dying, was pushing the Cummins engine past its breaking point. "We're almost there," Henry lied. They were still a mile out. He rolled down his driver's side window 2 inches, letting the negative 40-degree air blast directly onto his face to keep himself awake and focused. His arms ached with a deep lactic acid burn from wrestling the heavy steering wheel. Half a mile from his property, they hit a drift that was easily 6 feet high. The plow buried into it, and the bus groaned, the tires spinning uselessly. They were stuck. Panic rippled through the packed cabin. A woman began to sob. "Shut up," Henry roared, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. He couldn't fail now, not when they were so close. He threw the transmission into reverse, backing up 10 feet. He took a deep breath, shifted back into drive, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The diesel engine screamed, black smoke billowing from the exhaust. The bus slammed into the drift with the force of a battering ram. The impact threw everyone forward. The steel V-plow buckled slightly, but the sheer momentum of the heavily loaded bus tore through the ice wall. They broke out the other side, the engine whining in agony. Minutes later, the faint, golden glow of the LED lantern shining through his property gate came into view. Henry piloted the groaning, overheating bus onto his land, parking it safely behind the windbreak of his heavy steel garage. He shut off the engine. The sudden silence, save for the crackling of the wood stove in the back and the collective breathing of 82 people, was deafening. He let his head fall forward onto the steering wheel, his entire body trembling from exhaustion. From the back of the bus, a small voice broke the silence. It was Leo, Sarah's young son. "Mr. Henry," the boy said, "are we at the moon yet?" A weak, exhausted chuckle rippled through the freezing, packed crowd. Mayor Higgins, his face streaked with soot and tears, slowly made his way to the front of the bus. He looked at the heavy steel plating, the spray foam insulation, the roaring wood stove. He looked at the man he had mocked just months prior. "Henry," the mayor whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything, Tom," Henry replied gruffly, unbuckling his seatbelt and standing up to check the fire. "Just grab some more oak from the storage bay. We've got a long 3 days ahead of us." They stayed in the bus for 72 hours. The bomb cyclone raged outside, burying Crestwood under 6 feet of snow and snapping power lines across 3 counties. Inside the Bluebird, it was cramped, it smelled terrible, and meals consisted of rationed MREs and dried oats. But it was 70 degrees, and nobody died. When the National Guard finally broke through the roads with heavy rotary plows on Saturday morning, they found the town abandoned, save for a single yellow school bus parked on the outskirts, a plume of wood smoke rising defiantly into the clear, freezing sky. Henry Pendleton never received a medal. He didn't want one. But nobody in Crestwood ever made a joke about his paranoia again. And the next summer, when Henry went to Miller's Hardware to buy supplies to upgrade the bus's suspension, the owner absolutely refused to take his money. If Henry's incredible journey reminds us of anything, it's that the line between eccentric and visionary is often drawn by disaster. Survival isn't just about gear. It's about the grit to act when the world freezes over. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a true tale of resilience, and subscribe for more gripping survival stories.